Welcome back to Soul Talk. By now, in your group, hopefully you're learning to trust each other a little bit more and share at a deeper level. Because one of the greatest secrets to doing relationships well is realizing that other people can only love us to the degree that they know us. If we refuse to risk being vulnerable, then we'll never really feel truly accepted or loved. We've had all sorts of positive feedback from this resource, but the most common thing people are saying is that as groups have risked being honest, they've found that their relationships have grown closer than ever and created intimacy. So, if you're still sitting there letting others do all the sharing, then I want to challenge you to be brave this time around. In this episode, Belinda is talking about another issue that affects everyone at some point: grief. Belinda's going to teach us what grief is and how to grieve well so that we can get through it to the other side. Some groups find that they want to spend a couple of sessions on this topic, and that's fine. That's a good idea because then everyone can share whatever they need to. The last thing I want to say before we get started is that if big issues do come up for you during this episode and you feel like you need to see a professional counsellor to talk about stuff, then do. It's a great idea. But don't underestimate the power of sharing your grief with a group of people you trust. Can I pray for you? Father God, your word says that you place the lonely in families. It is not your desire for anyone to suffer alone. I pray that you would help us to know how to journey with each other, how to hold and carry each other through this topic of grief. May your Holy Spirit, your Wairua Tapu, be present with us. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
I relied on interviews rather than 15 of a year, whatever it is. I've never worked. Because I clear up.
Welcome back to Soul Talk. This week we're going to be taking a look at grief. In my experience, not many people seem to understand how to process grief well or at all. And there's a big problem with that, because if you don't process your grief, then it does build up, it does accumulate, and it does tend to spill over into multiple areas of your life. I think one of the problems is that most people tend to associate grief with death. They think that you grieve because somebody has died. But in reality, anytime we go through any kind of loss, we are going to have to grieve it, including a loss of possessions, property, pets, a real or perceived loss of your independence, your status, your innocence, your safety, major health changes like a stroke, infertility, a major accident, a brain injury, the loss of dreams and goals, being unfairly treated, punished, betrayed or accused, giving up an addiction, in particular what you gained from that addiction, losing a job, a career or a position that you value, a loss of friendships, the loss of idealism regarding your parents, the loss of idealism regarding ministry, threatened losses. This is an interesting one because the actual loss hasn't happened yet. The grieving process can't be completed, like when a parent is dying of a terminal illness. Even getting married can require some grieving, because although you've gained something, you've also lost something. Some of your freedom, some of your independence, the capacity to choose somebody else. Now that list could be 10 times, 100 times bigger, but I hope you get the idea. Grief is universal and it affects multiple areas. And in actuality, two people can go through the same loss and react to it quite differently, because grief is not about who or what you've lost, but the value that you've placed on it. I've had a number of people say to me over the years, my uncle died, my neighbour died, my grandma, my grandfather died, and I don't feel sad. Is there something wrong with me? And I will ask them, how close were you to that person? And the answer is always not very close. So my response is, well, no wonder. You didn't place a high value on the relationship. That's why you're not that upset about it. In contrast, I met a woman once who worked with a man who became like a father figure to her. When he died unexpectedly, she couldn't bring herself to go to the funeral because she was worried that she would be grieving more than the widow would be grieving, because she'd placed such a high value on the relationship. So grief is not about what or who you've lost, it's about the value that you've placed on it.
So I moved to New Zealand about 5 years ago, and I expected to feel homesickness when I moved here, but I didn't expect to feel grief, and I guess I didn't really know what grief was. One day, about a year into living in New Zealand, I was just confronted with this crazy wall of emotion, and I just didn't know what to do with it, and I didn't know what it was or where it came from. I really felt quite stuck, and I was just having a conversation with a friend at the time, and I just burst into tears and just couldn't stop crying, pretty much. And I was like, what is going on with me? I felt totally out of control, couldn't stop this motion that was flooding through me. And so I was like, well, there's something very wrong here. And I ended up chatting to a friend who had moved here from the States. And I thought, well, it's got to be something to do with immigrating. Let me talk to someone who's experienced it. And so what she said to me was, I think you're experiencing grief. And I thought, well, that's a bit crazy. People who have lost a loved one experience grief, but I've just moved countries. Like, what's that about? It was this weird combination of so happy to be here, but so sad not to be with my family, my friends, and my land, I guess. And so it was this strange tension of balancing both, and I think also letting my friends process it with me. It was this strange thing of going, I'm not sad to be here, like I love you guys, I want to be here, but I'm really sad not to be there. And so I was living in this weird tension.
So I am a twin, but my twin sister, she was stillborn, so we were 8 weeks early and she didn't survive. And I suppose the trauma of losing someone so with such a close connection to me, I developed, I guess, a subconscious kind of desire to not rely on anyone, not need anyone, not get close to anyone, to avoid that kind of pain of loss when they were no longer there. So I suppose I developed that, very early on in my kind of baby subconscious because of that trauma and that grief that was there from losing someone so close to me. That I didn't realise that I needed to grieve that. I didn't realise that those kind of feelings and that could be developed so early on. I was just blown away by how real and raw and powerful and painful those feelings were. So 29 years later, it was as if I had just lost her yesterday.
So, 10 years ago, actually this year, I was at a church and I got a missed call on my cell phone. So I stepped outside to answer it, and it was one of my good friends, and he said to me, has anyone spoken to you? And I said no, and he started crying. And I just knew straight away that something really, really bad had happened. And he said, your brother has just jumped off a bridge and he hasn't resurfaced. And I said, how long's it been? And he said, 20 minutes. I remember thinking to myself at the time, I can't do this. I remember thinking, I can't get through this. There were times where I'd cry so much that I actually thought it was going to kill me. Like, I actually thought, if I start crying now, I actually might die. Like, I know that sounds crazy, but I actually thought that. And you know, like, I'd cried before. I lost my cat once. I cried a lot, actually. I'd had injuries and I'd cried. But man, when you grieve for someone that you loved, someone that is part of your identity, someone that you don't want to live life without, it undoes you. You almost think, yeah, it'll kill you. You think, I'm not going to recover from this. And every time you cry and you do recover, it gives you confidence to do it again.
You may be starting to realise now that there are a lot of myths out there about grief, a lot of misunderstanding about what it is. And so let's start by taking a look at 6 of the most damaging ideas about grief. So number 1, grief is only sadness. This is a belief that's circulating around out there. In reality, grief is about many kinds of emotions. Back in the 1960s, the Swiss physician and psychiatrist Elisabeth Kubler-Ross pioneered death studies. And what she did was she studied the terminally ill and the process that they went through as they came to terms with their illness and the fact that they were going to die. She identified 5 distinct stages. The first one is denial. This can't be happening. This isn't real. The second stage is anger. Why me? Why is this happening to me? The third stage is bargaining. Maybe I can bargain my way out of this. Can I negotiate with God to not die? The fourth stage is depression. I'm going to die. Getting to the place of acceptance, nothing I can do about it, feeling low and defeated. The fifth stage, given the chance to grieve properly, the terminally ill person will come to the stage of acceptance, accepting what's going to happen. Now, grief is not as straightforward and cut and dried as that. It's not a linear thing. It's more like a roller coaster. Grief is all over the place. You may jump from anger to depression, back to anger, forward to bargaining. You may not experience some of those stages at all. You may experience them multiple times. But I hope you get the idea that grief involves many different types of emotions. Myth number 2, time will heal grief. Unfortunately, this is not true. A lot of people would like to think it is, but it isn't. Grief actually accumulates layer upon layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. And every new grief is another layer on top of the grief that you haven't yet faced. I remember a young guy saying to me, I went through a trauma that was so full on that I couldn't bring myself to face it. So for 2 years, I took drugs and got stoned and got wasted and didn't feel anything. At the end of 2 years, I had an encounter with God. I felt Him tell me to stop taking the drugs. I did, and I was overwhelmed with my grief, which totally shocked Him, as you can imagine. I was speaking at a church once, and this lovely older lady came and talked to me about it. She said, I know what you mean about time not healing grief. When I was young, I had a 14-month-old child, and then I gave birth to a baby. At 4 hours old, the baby died. 33 years later, she said to me, I was in counselling for something else, and my counsellor said to me, have you ever grieved losing your baby? And this lovely lady, she said to me, at that point I wept and wept and wept. It felt as real as if it had just happened. So no, time does not heal grief. We need to grieve to get through the things we've been through. Myth number 3, there's a time limit to grief. People think and say things like, you should be over this by now. We think we should be over it by now. The problem with that is if you go through a trauma, the numbness, the denial, the shock of that usually won't wear off for up to 6 months afterwards. So 4 to 7 months after you've been through this major thing, you're just ready to face it. But everybody else has gone back to their normal lives and thinks, why haven't you too? In actuality, grief usually takes around 18 to 24 months to fully process. But that isn't a hard and fast rule. It's very dependent on the person in the situation. Myth number 4, I should be able to do this on my own. Initially, when we go through a grief, we often do want privacy and space, which is understandable. But the thing is, grief is so exhausting. There is so much internal energy being used up as we process things that physically we become exhausted. And so we do need support. We need emotional support, we need physical support, and we often need to be honest about that and not feel like we're being a nuisance in taking it. Myth number 5 about grief is if I let my feelings out, I'll lose control. I've had a number of clients say to me, the pain I've been through is so great that I have dammed it up behind this wall. And if I was to cry even one tear, the dam would burst and I would never stop crying. And to some degrees, there's a little bit of truth in that, because when you open Pandora's box, you do feel pretty vulnerable for a time. But the thing to remember is this is just for a season. Your grief won't last forever, but as you grieve, you will gradually heal. And the final myth, number 6, you never really get over grief. I know some people believe this, but this has not been my personal experience. I've been able to recover from the loss of a child, my parents' divorce, being adopted, the rejection of some close friends, the suicides of some people close to me, and with the help of good counselling and great support, I have been able to recover from those things. Consider this quote, grief experienced does dissolve, The only grief that does not end is grief that has not been fully faced. So how do you grieve? Well, first of all, you stop avoiding it. It's actually been estimated that by the time a child is 15 years old, he has received more than 20,000 reinforcements that it's not acceptable to show or talk about sad feelings. We are trained into not expressing or experiencing or processing our grief. So the first thing we need to do is understand that grief is our friend because it helps us heal. The thing is, you can emerge from grief better or bitter. The choice is yours. So what that means is we need to face our grief. So what I recommend to my clients is that they actually schedule in grieving time. That may sound a little strange, but there are two reasons that it's really good to do this. One is that when you start to grieve, you'll start to feel better. And so then a lot of people will just stop partway through. They won't complete the process because they feel better enough that they're going to leave it alone. Because let's be honest, grief is not really fun. So scheduling it hopefully will mean that you carry it right through until you've healed from it. Second reason to schedule it is, as I said earlier, grief can be like opening Pandora's box. And if you're at work and you have clients or customers and your grief is rising up and it's not appropriate to go there at that moment in time, it's helpful for your brain to know that you've got Friday afternoon or Sunday morning to come back to that. And maybe you make a note on a phone or a notebook to say, this is what I need to look at on Friday. And it reassures your mind that we will get there. Now, what do you do in your grieving time? It's a little odd, isn't it? Well, to me, grief is like answering two questions. So the first question is, how is and how has this affected me emotionally? And as I said earlier, grief is compounded of many different emotions. You may feel anger, you may feel inadequacy and guilt, you may feel shame, you may feel regret, you may feel injustice, anger, rage, sadness, discouragement, despair. A whole lot of emotions get tangled up in grief. And the idea is to get them from the inside to the outside so they are not bottled up causing issues. So to do that, you may write some letters to some people. Don't send those letters. Just write them as a way to download. You may journal, you might do some art, you might tell your story to someone, you might go for a walk on the beach and have a scream, you might punch a punching bag, you might pray, you might put on worship music, whatever you need to do to let those emotions out so that they don't fester away inside you. The second question that we need to answer in our grieving time is, how has this affected me mentally? What's it done to your worldview, to your beliefs about different areas of life? A lot of people are okay at processing their emotions, but they don't think about the way that grief has affected the way they see things. Maybe it's affected the way you see yourself, your self-worth, your significance. Maybe it's affected the way you see trust or safety or romance or family or men or women. These things need to be addressed, otherwise we can get stuck in our grief. Often what happens is questions arise as we grieve. I've helped a lot of people recover from the suicides of people close to them, and suicide will raise a lot of questions like, whose fault is this? Why did this happen? What was my role? Could I have prevented this? Why did they choose to do that? Were there signs? Why didn't I see the signs? What if someone else does this? What's the point of life if people can do this? The problem is, if you don't answer those questions, you get stuck in that grief. It doesn't go away, it just lingers. And so often when my clients say to me, I don't get it, I feel like I've grieved this, I've cried over this so much, generally it's because they've never dealt with the mental side of things. Now, don't forget that when you are grieving, it's a great time to experience God's comfort. 2 Corinthians 1 verse 3 to 4 says that God is the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulations, so that with the comfort we have received, we may comfort others. So how do you know you've recovered from grief? Well, I think there are a few things that help us know that. Firstly, you lose the emotional intensity. It doesn't feel as full on anymore. Secondly, it moves from the foreground to the background. It's not dominating your life in the same way anymore. And thirdly, I think you know that you're nearly at the end of your grief when it's not hindering your life anymore. For example, there was a young woman that I counselled a while ago, and she had lost her fiance tragically, and they were madly in love, planning to get married, and it was an unexpected death, and it was devastating for her. Now, I knew she was nearly through her grief when she started dating again.
So I took the day off work and I sat down at home. I didn't really know where to begin, to be honest. I'd never grieved before or known how to do it at all. And so I sat down and said, okay, God, apparently I need to grieve and I have no idea how to do this. Please will you help me? And I felt him just saying, well, what does it mean for you to be in New Zealand? What does that actually look like? And I thought, well, it's a strange thing because I'm so happy to be here, but devastated not to be with my family and with my friends and all of that familiar stuff. And so I had to try and navigate this idea of being happy and content to be here, but sad not to be there. And as I thought about those things, I started writing down all the things I needed to grieve. So all the little things and all the big things that it meant to be in a country away from people I love. And so I started writing things down like, it means I don't get to hug my dad. It means I get to miss out on my brother's uni experience. It means I don't get to go to my friends' weddings and all of these things that were really, really painful. And some of the things I was surprised by, just tiny little everyday things. And so I wrote and wrote and wrote and filled up a good few pages, and they were all smudgy because I'd just been crying the whole way through. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I've done now. I know that I need to, when I feel this crazy emotion arriving, and it does, some days it literally just arrives, that I need to pause and stop and process stuff on paper between me and God, but then actually also let people in. And having those friends who know that I'm going through this is amazing because they can check in with me from time to time. And I don't have to feel afraid to talk to them about it. They know what's going on, and that's been great.
So I suppose I did quite practical things to grieve. I found that really helpful to do kind of practical, tangible things. So when I was back home over Christmas, I went to my twin sister's grave with a couple of family members. We took some flowers and kind of said a prayer, and it was a bit of a memorial service, a kind of a goodbye that I had never had the chance to do. That was really helpful and really really powerful. My mum gave me a book of sympathy cards that people had written her after my twin had died, and I just scheduled some time one night just to read through those, and that was really healing as well, just being able to kind of have a bit of a cry and read through those, and that helped with I guess getting out the grief and processing that.
Yeah, looking back on the last 10 years, there were a lot of people who helped me through my grief. I can think of a couple of friends who from day one have been there for me, and 10 years later will still ask me about my grief. Amazing, incredible friends. I also got some counselling, and interestingly, I reflected on this a few months ago. I started seeing my counsellor 6 months into my grief, and I've been seeing him for the last 10 years. And so I have been able to journey with him through my grief, through my marriage, through work stuff, through having a child. And I think that's one of the biggest blessings in my life, is to have him. And I'm glad that I initiated that relationship, early on. My family, I've been very lucky to have family that have been able to help me process it and talk. And every anniversary we get together with friends and with family, and we have a barbecue and we go for a walk and we share stories about Andy. Some years we sit around in a group and share stories. Some years we'll just go for a walk and I might have a chat with one person, but that's something really nice to do each year. I also keep a journal, so every anniversary I hate doing it, but I do it, is I get my journal, I go down to the beach, a place that's really important for me and my brother, and I just journal to him as if he was still around, and I tell him about what I've done that year, I tell him about my marriage, I tell him about all the things that I wish I could experience with him, and I don't know, I guess it's probably quite a helpful thing. It actually, to be honest, it forces me to process my grief, because 10 years later, it's probably the last thing I want to do on my birthday or on our anniversary, but it's a tradition I do, and I'm glad I do it.
There's one thing I want to reinforce to you before you go into your discussion time, and that is that grief is universal. Everybody in the entire world experiences grief at some point in their lives, because loss and disappointment is universal. It's part of being a human. So I want to encourage you, if you are grieving right now, you are not alone. I also want to encourage you that if you're sitting there thinking there are things in my past that I have never grieved and I probably should, that this could be the time for you to start scheduling in that grieving time. Start putting aside that time to face the things that need to be faced. You will feel a lot better as you work through that stuff. Let's pray. Lord, I praise you that your desire is to heal us from grief. I praise you that when we go through pain and suffering, you walk through it with us and you come alongside us to be our comforter and to bring healing, that the day may come that we are so healed and so restored from the things we've been through that we are able to pass your comfort on to others. And so I pray for everyone listening to this resource at the moment, wherever they may be, whatever they may be going through, that they will come to understand grief in a much greater way, and that they will become people that can encourage others to grieve when they need to. That we would not be a nation that shuts grief down, but we would be a nation that does what we need to in order to be healed. Amen. See you next week.